Welcome to the Golden Gems podcast. Today we're taking a deep dive into the Sackler dynasty and how their pharmaceutical empire manufactured the American opioid crisis, bought immunity, and turned addiction into a permanent, multi-billion-dollar business model.
It is a really massive, heavy architecture to audit. I mean, we are looking at a timeline that stretches all the way from the invention of clinical pharmaceutical marketing in the 1950s, right up to the $7.4 billion legal settlement that was enacted on May 1st, 2026.
Right. And the objective of this deep dive is to trace that entire architecture for you, because the core argument we have to confront today is pretty chilling.
Yeah, it really is.
We want to demonstrate that the American addiction pipeline is not some broken system. It's a machine operating exactly as it was designed to.
Precisely. And, to understand how Purdue Pharma managed to flood the entire country with OxyContin in the 1990s, we actually have to jump back 40 years earlier.
We need to reconstruct the genealogical foundations of all this.
Exactly. We need to look at the man who essentially wrote the blueprint for medicalizing human anxiety. Talking about Arthur Sackler.
Right, who was born in Brooklyn, trained as a psychiatrist in the 1950s. But his true historical footprint isn't really in psychiatry at all, is it?
No, not at all. His legacy is entirely in marketing. He became arguably the most consequential pharmaceutical marketer in American history because Arthur had this fundamental revelation that completely upended the industry.
Which is what, exactly?
Well, before him, pharmaceutical companies tried to sell the chemistry of a drug directly to a patient based on an existing illness. Arthur realized you don't do that. You sell the drug to the doctor, and you sell it to the culture.
Okay, so you shift the target audience.
Right, but most importantly, you have to manufacture the condition first.
Wait, walk me through that. What does manufacturing the condition actually look like in practice during the 1950s?
So Arthur looked at the daily lives of American housewives. He took their everyday stress, their baseline societal pressures, and he pathologized it.
He framed everyday life as a disease.
Exactly. He told the medical establishment that this normal baseline human anxiety was actually a clinical condition requiring chemical intervention. And by doing that, he effectively created the mass market for a drug called Valium.
Mother's little helper. So he doesn't just push a pill, he frames the entire cultural narrative around why you supposedly need it.
Yep, and it worked brilliantly. By 1978, Valium becomes the most prescribed drug in America.
Yeah.
Even though the medical reality was that it caused severe dependence and really brutal withdrawal.
But the sales engine just kept accelerating anyway.
It did. And Arthur understood those mechanical drawbacks, but he focused on the revenue. He then took those massive profits and funneled them into this absolute masterclass of legacy washing.
Right. He becomes a high society patron of the arts, plastering the Sackler name on wings of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Louvre in Paris, the Guggenheim.
Exactly. He builds this pristine philanthropic reputation directly on the backs of chemically dependent housewives.
It's incredible. It feels like Arthur didn't just invent a popular marketing campaign. He basically coded the original operating software for modern pharmaceutical sales.
That's a perfect way to put it.
Which makes me wonder, how did the next generation of Sacklers take that cultural software and weaponize it with new technology?
Well, they took Arthur's marketing software and applied it to a devastating new piece of hardware. In the 1990s, his nephews and nieces, specifically Richard and Kathy Sackler, took control of Purdue Pharma.
Which was just a relatively small family-owned company at the time.
Yeah, relatively minor. But Purdue had developed this technical breakthrough known as the Contin system.
Contin meaning continuous release.
Right, that's the marketing term for it. Mechanically, it's a polymer matrix. The idea was to embed a highly powerful painkiller inside a chemical shell that dissolves incredibly slowly in the gastrointestinal tract, usually over about 12 hours.
So by delivering the drug steadily, it theoretically prevents that massive spike or the high that triggers addiction.
Exactly the theory. They originally used this matrix on morphine, but in 1996, they applied it to oxycodone, and they called the resulting product OxyContin.
But, and this is crucial, there's a fatal architectural flaw built right into that design.
A massive flaw.
Because that slow release is literally the only mechanism keeping the user from experiencing an overwhelming high. If you simply crush the pill or even just suck off that outer coating, you break the matrix completely.
You do. You get the entire 12-hour dose of pure oxycodone dumped into your bloodstream all at once. It instantly becomes a highly addictive weapon.
And Purdue was entirely aware of that vulnerability, weren't they?
Oh, they absolutely knew. Yet when they filed for FDA approval in 1995, They leaned heavily on the claim that the time-release mechanism made the drug less addictive than other short-acting opioids.
Which regulators just bought hook, line, and sinker.
Well, the FDA ended up approving it, but it was driven largely by one specific regulator named Curtis Wright. And Wright signed off on this approval based on a staggeringly bold claim in the paperwork that the addiction risk of OxyContin was less than 1%.
I'm really hung up on that number. Less than 1%. Was there any rigorous, independent clinical data backing that up?
None. There was literally zero clinical evidence justifying that specific metric.
Wow.
And the timeline of what happened next is just incredibly damning. Shortly after pushing that approval through, Curtis Wright left the FDA.
Let me guess where he went.
He eventually landed a job at Purdue Pharma for a reported starting salary of $400,000 a year.
I mean, talk about the ultimate golden parachute. You approve their miracle drug and then miraculously float right onto their payroll. It's a staggering conflict of interest.
It's regulatory capture in its purest form. And with that FDA blessing secured, Purdue completely unleashes their sales force.
Right, we are talking about 671 representatives blanketing the country, and they aren't just, dropping off informational pamphlets in waiting rooms.
No, they are funding resort vacations. They are paying exorbitant speaker fees to physicians. They established the Purdue Speakers Bureau.
Which was basically a mechanism to literally pay doctors to recommend OxyContin to their peers, right?
Exactly. It was a financial incentive loop masquerading as medical education.
When you look at the standard corporate defense in these situations, executives always hide behind the phrase, aggressive marketing.
Right, the standard PR line.
But I push back on that entirely. I mean, look at the math in places like Kermit, West Virginia. This is a town with a population of just 392 people.
The Kermit data is just horrifying.
Over a 2-year period, a single pharmacy in that town received 9 million oxycodone pills. I want you to really process that ratio. 9 million pills for 392 people. That defies any biological definition of medicine.
It does. When you do the math, it's dozens of pills per person every single day for years.
Right. That is a deliberate, corporate-sponsored flood.
We pull the lens back. It wasn't just isolated to rural Appalachia either. This flood intentionally targeted vulnerable, working-class communities across the entire country.
Places that were already struggling economically.
Like Kensington in Philadelphia, a neighborhood already hollowed out by the collapse of textile mills and industrial jobs. Purdue's data-driven sales force specifically identified these areas.
So the addiction wasn't an accident?
Not at all. It was manufactured in a boardroom in Stamford, Connecticut, by executives who viewed working-class physical and economic pain purely as a market opportunity.
So when the bodies inevitably start piling up in places like Kensington and Kermit, where is the government? The DEA had to see this happening. Why didn't they just shut off the faucet?
Well, they certainly tried. By the mid-2000s, DEA agents on the ground, people like James Gelthoff, were tracking distribution patterns that made absolutely no medical sense.
Because by law, drug distributors are required to report suspicious high-volume orders, right?
They are. And the logistics of this pipeline were controlled by a massive triopoly, McKesson, Cardinal Health, and AmerisourceBergen. Together, they controlled 85% of the U.S. distribution market.
So they had the data. They saw the astronomical spikes in these tiny towns.
They saw everything. But the cash flow was simply too lucrative to hit the brakes. They kept the trucks rolling.
And when the DEA finally started building aggressive cases to freeze these shipments and pull their distribution licenses, how did the industry respond?
They didn't panic. They simply shifted battlegrounds. They weaponized the legislative process. In 2016, Representatives Tom Marino and Marcia Blackburn introduced a piece of legislation known as H.R. 471.
Let me guess, backed by a massive influx of pharmaceutical lobbying money.
Nearly $1 million in pharma donations to those specific representatives, actually. But the mechanics of the bill are what really matter. H.R. 471 was written by a former DEA attorney named Lyndon Barber.
Wait, a former DEA attorney?
Yes, who had flipped sides and was currently working for Cardinal Health.
Okay, so the industry's own lawyer writes a federal bill. What did H.R. 471 actually do to the DEA's enforcement power?
It fundamentally neutered their capability by changing a few crucial words in the law. Previously, the DEA could freeze drug shipments if they posed an imminent danger.
Which makes sense for an enforcement agency.
Right, but H.R. 471 raised the burden of proof. It required the DEA to prove a substantial likelihood of an immediate threat to public health before they can intervene.
That sounds like a minor semantic shift, but legally, that's a massive roadblock.
Exactly. You have to prove the threat is immediate and substantial before you can even hit pause on a shipment.
It's regulatory capture in plain sight. They effectively bought the regulators, and while the DEA is handcuffed by this new legal standard, the pill mills go into hyperdrive.
You have operations like the George Brothers down in Florida moving 20 million pills in 3 years at a strip mall clinics.
And then, once the addiction is thoroughly entrenched across the country, the industry figures out how to monopolize the antidote.
Which introduces us to the next phase of the architecture, a drug called Suboxone, manufactured by a company called Reckitt Benckiser.
Right, Suboxone.
It's what's known as a partial opioid agonist.
Stop there. Explain partial opioid agonist for me. How does that actually work in the brain?
So when someone takes a full opioid like OxyContin or heroin, the chemical binds completely to the opioid receptors in the brain. That creates a massive dopamine release and suppresses breathing.
That's the euphoric high and the overdose risk.
Right. But a partial agonist like Suboxone is different. It parks itself in those exact same receptors, but it doesn't activate them fully.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it satisfies the brain's craving, which prevents agonizing withdrawal symptoms, but it blocks the euphoric high.
So it is effectively the cure, or at least the primary maintenance treatment to get your life back.
It is a vital treatment. But Reckitt Benckiser held the exclusive patent on the Suboxone tablet. And as that patent was nearing expiration, which would have allowed cheap, generic versions to flood the market and help millions of people, the company utilized a predatory legal tactic called product hopping.
How does product hopping work in this context?
They slightly altered the physical format of the medication. They switched it from a hard tablet to a dissolvable film strip that melts under the tongue.
Even though the active chemical compound was exactly the same.
Exactly the same. But because the delivery mechanism was quote-unquote new, they convinced regulators to grant them a fresh patent.
That's incredibly cynical.
And it gets worse. They then aggressively pulled the original tablets off the market, citing totally dubious safety concerns. This effectively blocked the cheap generics from reaching patients.
Because the generic was based on the tablet, which is now discontinued.
Right. The Federal Trade Commission eventually caught up with them and forced a $1.4 billion settlement for antitrust violations. But again, no one went to jail.
It's absolute madness. It is literally like an arsonist aggressively marketing and selling you the fire, then lobbying the government to defund your local fire department, and then turning around and aggressively patenting the only brand of fire extinguisher so they can charge you a premium for it.
That is the precise cyclical mechanism of the pipeline. But, it forces us to ask a broader historical question. Why has the American state consistently allowed this to happen?
Because the conventional wisdom we're all taught is that drug epidemics are just local anomalies. We think of them as local medical failures or lapses in border security.
Exactly. But the historical record demonstrates that state-tolerated drug pipelines are actually a structural feature of American geopolitical policy.
The history here is staggering when you connect the dots. The government turning a blind eye to illicit supply chains is not a new phenomenon at all.
Just consider the aftermath of World War II. The CIA forged an alliance with the Corsican Mafia in France, the syndicate at the heart of the famous French Connection.
Right. Why would the CIA ally with the Mafia?
The CIA needed the Mafia's muscle to break up communist dock worker strikes in Marseille. And in exchange for that political violence, the U.S. intelligence apparatus provided political cover,
allowing the Mafia to refine heroin from Southeast Asia and funnel it directly onto American streets.
And they ran the exact same playbook during the Vietnam War. The CIA literally used its proprietary airline, Air America, to help a warlord named Vang Pao move raw opium out of the mountains of Laos.
They facilitated a drug trade that directly resulted in thousands of American veterans coming home with severe heroin addictions.
And we saw it again post 9/11 in Afghanistan. The U.S. military actively protected vast opium fields because destroying that cash crop would have alienated vital allied warlords like Ahmed Wali Karzai.
The structural reality is that the state will tolerate and sometimes actively protect devastating illicit supply chains as long as they serve a broader geopolitical or economic purpose.
Exactly. So the Sacklers didn't invent the concept of American drug addiction. They just brought it into the boardroom and industrialized it.
And because that underlying pipeline was never dismantled structurally, it simply mutated. It evolved into something cheaper, faster, and deadlier. Which brings us to the sheer scale of the modern tragedy.
1 million dead.
1 million human beings. The pipeline shifted from prescription OxyContin to street heroin to synthetic fentanyl. Fentanyl alone drove the death toll to over 108,000 in the year 2022.
But viruses mutate to survive. By 2026, the crisis evolved into something even more horrific, xylazine, commonly known on the street as tranq.
And tranq isn't even an opioid, right? It's a veterinary sedative.
Yes, it's literally designed to tranquilize large animals like horses.
Yeah.
And because it is not an opioid, it is entirely immune to reversal drugs like Narcan.
Oh, man. So the primary safety net is just gone.
Right. If a user overdoses on a mixture of fentanyl and xylazine, a first responder might administer Narcan to block the fentanyl, but the xylazine continues to aggressively suppress their central nervous system.
First responders are just standing on street corners watching people fail to revive after 3-4 doses of Narcan.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And beyond the overdose risk, xylazine causes severe vasoconstriction.
Clamp that down for me. What does severe vasoconstriction actually do to a human body?
It constricts the blood vessels so tightly that oxygen can no longer reach the skin and muscle tissue. The tissue essentially suffocates, dies, and begins to rot.
That's horrifying.
It causes massive necrotic flesh wounds. We are seeing people in Kensington and the Bronx facing emergency amputations of their arms and legs from a chemical that was never meant to interact with human biology.
And the health department in Philadelphia reported that xylazine has now saturated over 90% of the local fentanyl supply. The street supply has devolved into a literal horror movie.
It really has.
But what about the people trying to get clean? You would think the legal treatment industry is a safe harbor, but it's actually its own kind of extraction trap.
Yeah, it is the pipeline inside the treatment pipeline. Private equity firms, massive corporate entities like Baymark and Acadia now own and operate 562 methadone clinics across the country.
And methadone, when used correctly, is a highly effective treatment, right?
It is. But it is heavily regulated by the government. Patients generally have to physically travel to a clinic every single day to swallow their dose under strict supervision.
And from a private equity standpoint, that daily requirement isn't a medical necessity, it's a captive market.
Exactly the issue. The financial engine of a for-profit clinic relies on daily billing. The business model fundamentally prioritizes patient retention over patient recovery.
It's essentially the software as a service model applied to human addiction.
It is. The trade association representing these clinics has actively lobbied against federal guidelines, SAM-HSA guidelines, that would have allowed stable patients to take their doses home.
Why? Because fewer in-person visits mean less daily revenue.
Exactly. And the cruelty compounds when you look at what happens inside the traditional medical system alongside this. You have psychiatrists prescribing benzodiazepines to these very same patients.
People going to methadone clinics are being prescribed Xanax or Klonopin to deal with their withdrawal anxiety.
Yes. Which creates a lethal physiological collision. Both benzodiazepines and opioids suppress the respiratory system. When you combine them, the margin between feeling relief and slipping into a fatal overdose narrows to almost zero.
It is a horrific full-circle irony. Benzodiazepines are Arthur Sackler's original drug class from the 1950s.
They are.
The modern user is caught in this impossible pharmaceutical triathlon. They are running between street fentanyl laced with animal tranquilizer, private equity-owned methadone clinics billing them daily, and legally prescribed benzos.
It is a race where the only finish line is death.
Which finally brings us to the culmination of this entire timeline, the legal system's final word on all of this. On May 1st, 2026, the $7.4 billion settlement with Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family officially became effective.
Right, and we need to lay out the reality of what that date actually accomplished. Purdue Pharma shuts down. Its assets and operations transfer to a newly formed entity called Noah Pharma LLC.
And 30 million internal corporate documents are finally released to the public domain. But what consequences do the Sacklers actually face?
Well, they receive full permanent civil immunity, 0 prison time for any family member. And crucially, they get to keep the estimated $11 billion they strategically transferred into private offshore trusts in the years before the company filed for bankruptcy.
So they agreed to pay $7.4 billion over the course of several years, but their personal fortunes and freedom are permanently insulated.
Exactly.
I want you to really process the grim mathematics of this settlement. Take that $7.4 billion, divide it by the 1 million dead. It equals exactly $7,400 per human life.
$7,400 a body.
The analysts reviewing this settlement make a devastating argument. This isn't a penalty. This is the American legal system essentially codifying the destruction of working-class communities as an acceptable, pre-calculated business expense.
It is a devastating contrast. You have total boardroom immunity on one side of the ledger and the visceral, boots-on-the-ground reality on the other.
Right.
Look at figures like Rosalind Pichardo in Kensington. She literally stands on the corner, armed with Narcan, pulling people back from the brink of death. She has personally recorded 628 overdose reversals.
Wow.
She literally keeps a tally in the margins of her Bible.
628 human lives saved by one woman on a street corner. She is doing the grueling, traumatic work that a multi-billion-dollar legal settlement and all those museum wings with the Sackler names plastered on them were never designed to do.
The institutions that were supposed to protect the public, the federal regulators, the legislators, the private treatment industries, they all extracted their margin of profit. The state collected its massive settlement check, and the communities were left to absorb the bodies.
It leaves us with a provocative, almost terrifying final thought about where this all goes next, because in 2026, a new fentanyl vaccine is currently in human trials.
Right, a vaccine.
It's designed to create antibodies that bind to fentanyl in the blood, blocking the drug from ever crossing the blood-brain barrier. Scientifically, it sounds like an absolute miracle.
It does.
But think about the ecosystem it is entering. This vaccine will be patented. It will be priced for profit. It will be manufactured and distributed by the exact same healthcare and corporate architecture that enabled the Sacklers to operate for decades.
Will a scientific breakthrough finally break this cycle of destruction? Or will this vaccine just become the next lucrative captive market for the very machine that manufactured the crisis in the first place?
It is the ultimate philosophical question of this entire audit. The chemical product might change, but the pipeline always stays open.
Exactly.
Thank you for listening to the Golden Gems podcast. We'll be back next time with another deep dive. Until then, keep exploring, keep listening, and keep celebrating the power of uncompromising voices.